like this. Is that all right, Tracy, or do we need the slideshow?
Slideshow would probably be better if that's okay.
Yeah, let's have a look.
Leeds Beck are taking over this session, aren't they? Good.
Indeed. Representation.
Is
that any better?
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you, Gareth. Cheers.
Excellent. Yeah, so I think, yeah, this presentation probably follows on quite nicely from Kevin's, and we'll certainly pick up on some of the notions of autonomy support potentially at the end of it. But I'm going to talk today a little bit about some perfectionistic reactivity, and this is some work we've been doing recently with students and colleagues across Leeds Beckett and York St John University. So to start with, in terms of perfectionism and what we mean by it, it's a personality disposition that's inherently motivational. It involves, broadly speaking, kind of the pursuit of excessively high standards, and also the kind of notion of those being accompanied by criticism, either from ourselves or from other people. And lots of different researchers have kind of tried to look at perfectionism in slightly different ways and have picked up on this kind of constellation of different dimensions that make up this thing we might call perfectionism. Now, if you look across the literature, that all gets quite complex and a bit messy. But fortunately, researchers have also kind of looked at this in terms of factor analytical studies where we take all these different dimensions, and what typically comes out are two broad things. So on the one hand, perfectionistic strivings, and the two dimensions that are probably most commonly researched in sport are self-oriented perfectionism and personal standards. In essence, pursuing perfection, pursuing exacting standards, accompanied by harsh self-criticism. And then on the other side of things, we've got perfectionistic concern. So that encompasses things like chronic concern over making mistakes in competition or training, also doubts about action and being able to act in the way that we would like to, and also the kind of social element to perfectionism, whereby we feel as though we have to pursue somebody else's standards that they're placing on us. So that might be from a coach or from a parent. And what's more, those standards feel out of reach. And we feel as though those people are going to harshly criticize us if we don't meet those standards. Now, they are two kind of distinct broad dimensions, strivings and concerns. But what typically happens is, if we look across all the studies that have been done in sport, they often highly correlate with one another. So they come out as kind of important entities on their own, but they're often highly correlated, which is an important thing just that I'll come back to as we go through the course of the results that I'm going to display in a little while. But I thought what might be quite interesting is for us to perhaps start by measuring our own perfectionism this morning, and just considering maybe for ourselves and maybe for our athletes, what this might mean for us. So as you can see there, you've got a measure of perfectionistic striving, specifically self-oriented perfectionism. And I'd just like you to give yourself a score from 1 to 7 on each of those items. So 1 to 4. I'll just give you a minute to consider those. All right, hopefully that's just about enough time. So obviously you should have a score. If you total them up, the high point would be 28 or the low point would be 4. So just kind of give yourself a kind of indication of whereabouts you sit on that striving scale. And then for concerns, we can do the same thing. So these are the kind of concerns items for socially prescribed perfectionism. Okay, hopefully we're just about there on that one. Again, between 4 and 28 consider whereabouts you are in terms of that overall score. And we'll kind of reflect on that as we go through the rest of the presentation. Now, if we look at perfectionism, one concept that's kind of linked closely to that is this notion by Gordon Flett and Paul Hewitt around the idea that if we're high on those scales, we might be more prone to react to negative situations in a highly emotional manner. Okay, so beyond kind of those that might be lower on perfectionism, if we're high in those perfectionistic tendencies, both strivings and concerns or one or the other, Flett and Hewitt have argued that we're potentially more prone to react emotionally. And they package this in a series of different ways. And again, I just invite you to kind of consider how maybe yourself and your athletes might react personally to these situations. So, for instance, learning a new sport, dance or exercise, so maybe particularly pertinent for those working with young athletes, potentially making their first forays into sport. Failures, loss, or being outperformed by a competitor, obviously a challenge that we all come up against in sport. Just consider how you might react to that and how your players do. What happens if we make a key mistake in a high pressure situation? Equally, what happens if we set ourselves a goal, be that either personal or for the team, and then we don't quite reach that goal? How do we tend to react to that? What do we feel like when we have our imperfections and inadequacies exposed, particularly in public? Okay. And then also alongside that, how do we feel when we get criticized publicly or privately? The next one is kind of those life events that might impact the self. So perhaps, you know, we have the death of a loved one, or we may be split up with a partner or something along those lines. How do we then react within our sporting context? How do we feel when we encounter an injury or an illness? How do we adapt to new or unfamiliar situations? So maybe we join a new team, or maybe we go up a league or down a league. How do we tend to react when we have those transitions? And then the last one, which is quite often closely linked to perfectionism, is this notion of burnout. So how do we feel when things start to become kind of chronic in terms of fatigue and those types of exhaustion elements that maybe Kevin was picking up on it in regards to some of the stuff around recovery? Okay. Now, what we've found is that, broadly speaking, there's some support for this in the literature. So people have found, for instance, links between concern over mistakes and higher levels of generally feeling bad, negative affect, feeling shame and embarrassment. They've found higher levels of threat linked with self-oriented perfectionism. We've got higher levels of guilt and lower levels of pride. And we've also found that there's also a kind of link with performance as well. So we've got kind of worse when perfectionistic concerns are high, but potentially better performance when perfectionistic concerns are low. So broadly speaking, we've started to just kind of tap into a few of these links, and there's a little bit of support for this notion that perfectionists might be more prone to react in an emotional manner. But those studies basically only pick up on two things. They pick up on the failures and losses, or being outperformed by a competitor, or they pick up on the non-attainment of goals. Okay, so what we would keen to try and do in our own work is to address these shortcomings. Okay, so look at these scenarios more broadly and start to tap into a few that maybe haven't been looked at yet, and also pick up on this notion that most of the studies you saw on screen there have been done with student athletes, and they've been done in kind of contrived tasks. So for instance, bringing them into a lab and getting them sat on an exercise bike and cycling might not have been their kind of chosen sport. So we wanted to see how we could make this a little bit more personally meaningful. And we've done a few studies on this. The one I'm going to present today is on rugby. Okay, so we did this with rugby players around about a couple of years ago now. And what we posed to them were some scenarios that were hopefully relevant to them in terms of their rugby experiences. So we tried to focus in on making a key mistake. Again, picked up on that non-attainment of goals, because that often gets linked in with perfectionism. We also tried to tap into kind of the more social element in terms of having their imperfections exposed. And also we were interested in what might happen if they're exposed to a new, potentially unfamiliar environment or a bit of a transition element. So trying to look at it in a bit more of a broader sense than what had been done before. Okay, so the way in which we did that was we posed some scenarios to them, which you'll see in a minute, and we asked them to state how angry they would be in response to these scenarios. Okay, so for instance, I'm furious, and it was done on a never to always in response to these scenarios. So again, it's a 1 to 7, 1 never, and 7 always. And again, encourage you to maybe kind of fill this in for yourselves as we go through. Okay. So the first one was for the non-attainment of goals. And what we did was we were trying to look at kind of a high prime and a low prime condition. So kind of high prime was where the stakes are quite high, and low prime was where the stakes are a little bit lower. So in this non-attainment of goals one, we've got, imagine that it's the last play of the playoff final. Winning will secure your team's goal of winning the league and gaining promotion. You receive the ball 10 meters out and spot a gap in the defensive line. The whole team and fan base is resting on you to score the try. You hit the gap, but the fullback spots you and tackles you into touch. You've lost the game and we'll have to wait until next season for another shot of promotion. Okay. And then that was versus kind of, imagine this is the last playoff final. Winning will secure your team's goal. You receive the ball 10 meters out, spot a gap in the defensive line. The whole team and fan base is resting on you to score the try. Hit the gap, run through and score under the post. Okay. So that was our kind of low prime, obviously a success scenario versus a high prime, a failure scenario. We also picked up on making mistakes. So you've got this one in terms of the high element. Thanks, Tracy. So you're playing in a league game against your main rivals. The opposition is on the way to score the try. You're the last line of defense. You go in for the tackle, but miss, and this leads to them scoring the try at the game and winning the game. Versus you're playing in a league game against your main rivals. The opposition is on the way to score a try. You're going for a tackle. You miss, but your teammates come round and help you out basically and stop the try being scored. Okay, so given time, I'm not going to go into the other scenarios, but you get the idea in terms of the high or low prime element. So it's either success or failure, or it's high stakes or low stakes. Okay, so this is what we found. So in terms of the non-attainment of goals, for instance, we found that if you're high in perfectionistic concerns, in terms of that high prime condition, that failure condition, you're going to be more likely to be angry in regards to that. And then in regards to the making mistakes element, which we looked at, this was interesting in the fact that not only in the high prime condition, where the mistake happened and the other team scored the try and won the game, you're seeing that link, but also in the low prime condition. So even when we make a mistake and the outcome isn't all that bad, we're still seeing high levels of anger in that individual for making the mistake. Okay. And then I'm just going to skip through the next couple. And what happens, remember at the start I said that perfectionistic concerns and strivings are often highly correlated with one another. If we put them both into the mix and we take perfectionism as a whole, what we tend to find is that in high prime conditions, such as making a mistake, we're seeing significant results here. So both strivings and concerns might be problematic together when it comes to things like non-attainment of goals, making mistakes, and also when we expose imperfections in public. Okay, so just a couple of key take-homes and things to consider. Overall, perfectionism is associated with heightened emotional reactivity. So our study, along with the other studies, suggests that. It appears most prominent in response to things like failure and non-attainment of goals. We didn't find as much support for it being problematic in relation to adapting to new environments. And then I'd just like you to consider these questions, maybe, in terms of your own practice and perhaps for your players. How do these conclusions compare to the responses you had? Do they reflect the reactions you've seen in your athletes? And are there scenarios from your sport, bearing in mind that they're going to be different depending on the sport that you're involved in, that might prime or buffer against, as Kevin was talking about, that perfectionistic reactivity? All right, thanks very much, folks. Any questions? More than happy to try and answer some if we've got time, Tracy.
Yeah, we do. You're spot on. Gareth, well done.
Thanks.
On time. Fantastic. Very interesting. Obviously, I love the perfectionistic reactivity stuff, but I'll open up the floor for questions.
I think maybe Kevin had one there.
Just a little clap, Gareth, but
oh, sorry.
I will have it. I was formulating a question as you said that, so I will go ahead if that's okay.
Sure.
How often would you look at those types of questions that you got us to do in terms of those scaling questions? Is that once a year? Do those things change as people's perception of pressured scenarios? So let's say pre-season, you do that questionnaire and you get these scores and you identify where people are. But as the season progresses and people recognize they're getting into playoff positions, are their mindsets or their perceptions changing as well? So you maybe have to do more intervention work as those pressured scenarios occur?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in terms of the perfectionism side of things, maybe if we deal with that first, it's considered a personality disposition. So what that means in terms of the likelihood of how it might play out, it's relatively stable over time. So if we were to measure all our players at the start of the season, no interventions put in place or anything, and measure them at the end of the season in terms of perfectionism, we might see small fluctuations depending on the scenarios that they're exposed to, but we'd expect that there'd be some level of stability in terms of their perfectionism scores, at least. The thing that this stuff kind of picks up on is that at the other end of things, in terms of their reactions, they're more amenable to change. So we might be able to have more of an impact on how people might respond to those scenarios. So that's kind of picked up quite nice in some of the work that colleagues have done, such as Dan Madigan, in terms of the longitudinal links between perfectionism and burnout over the course of a season. What you tend to find is that those higher, particularly perfectionistic concerns, might be more prone to burnout at the end of the season. Now, that could be important when we're thinking about kind of training loads and that type of thing. And I think what this stuff has started to tap into, and we need to do more work, is that maybe there's some work to be done here in terms of the easier wins, if you like, the low-hanging fruit, the emotional reactions, the cognitions, the thought processes that Tracy's done some lovely work on as well, in terms of those being the elements that we might be able to just address a little bit more easily, rather than that more ingrained disposition that people might have. So, you know, how do we do that? I think some of your work that you presented this morning, Kevin, in terms of we've seen some promise with things like autonomy support and creating that sort of more self-determined environment, if you like, in regards to that being quite potentially beneficial in terms of buffering against some of the negative impact of perfectionism. So more work to be done in that field, because we've just kind of scratched the surface a bit. But I think that can be, you know, potentially pretty powerful if we're able to create those environments.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gareth. I'm just conscious of time. Ella, do you want to ask your question quickly, and then we'll move on?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you when you get to a certain high level of sport, do you sort of have to work with the coaches as well? Because I can imagine they put a perfectionistic view in their athletes in terms of, you know, if the guy's kicking for the post every time in rugby, you know, if they're making him do it 20 times every training session, of course he's going to start to have those expectations. So is it working with the team as well as just the athlete?
It certainly is, yeah. I think that's really important to pick up on, Ella. Some recent work, not that I've done in sport, but in dance, we've actually looked at dance teachers and their levels of things like perfectionism and autonomy support. And what we found there is that they're less inclined to provide autonomy support if they're highly perfectionistic, and they're more likely to be stressed out if they're highly perfectionistic as well, which no doubt is going to have a knock-on effect in terms of how they might interact with their players. So I think maybe the more that we can do joint work where we look not only at the players, but also the coach and the broader support staff as well, the better in terms of sort of this work moving forward.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Cheers.
Brilliant, Gareth. Thanks so much. And
Thanks, Tracy.
Cheers. And we'll now pass on to our final speaker of this session, Gillian Fowler. Who's going to talk about the impact of coaching on walking spinal community's motivation to engage in physical activity. So I'll pass over to Gillian. I'll give you 2 minutes.
That's great. Thank you. Share the screen.